Hey everybody, in today's episode I'm going to do a review of a very recent article from geopolitical analyst F. William Engdahl. He's somebody who I really recommend. He's got a number of fabulous books that go over basically the history of the deep state and its development over the centuries. In his book Gods of Money, he tracks the financial aspect of it through history. In his book Myths, Lies, and Oil Wars, he goes over the sort of Rockefeller oil oligarch aspect of the deep state and how there's an aspect of national security that got interwoven with the politics of petroleum and coal. And During the First World War, there was sort of a great game being played in the Middle East for who could control and gain access and leverage the oil reserves of the Middle East in order to fuel both their military and then the sort of economic world order that would emerge that was based on fossil fuels. So the major oil corporations and particularly oil, but I mean, you could say all the major mining and industrial corporations have always been seen as important and vital instruments of the military and of national security for obvious reasons, because national security is dependent on war making ability, and these industries are vital to that effort. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we see the global economy over the course of the 20th century become tethered to the oil trade, and we have something called the petrodollar emerge, which is the sort of financial linkage or the link between the U.S. economy and financial system with this oil trade, and that linkage makes that industry a vital national security interest. So the major players in that industry are not autonomous corporations who can just pursue whatever they want. They are instrumental to national security. So there's like a public-private partnership in national security. And we can see this public-private partnership develop not only between oil corporations, but also banks and national security. What we're seeing today is the revelation of the pharmaceutical and sort of medical system with national security, because, as is my thesis, is that what we're seeing today is a national security state initiative rather than a health crisis and response situation. The underlying that, there's a national security issue. Now, F. William Engdahl also lays out in another one of his books the link between those oil oligarchs and the national security who came to dominate the national security state because of the role they played in securing this vital resource of petroleum, but that those same interests then used the petroleum to take over agriculture, and that there was a national security initiative behind that to control the world through controlling the food resources. So overall, there's a psychology of full spectrum dominance, which is that if there's an area of life that can be studied and controlled and consolidated, that it must be controlled and consolidated for reasons of national security, because if we don't do it, someone else could do it. So it's a real race to the bottom mentality. So anyway, I say all that to say that F. William Engdahl is a very important analyst. I definitely recommend his stuff. He's got a website called William Engdahl, which is ENGDAHL, WilliamEngdahl.com, and he posts a lot of very relevant news analyses on his website. And so the article I'm going to read today, or read some notes from today, it was posted. It's the newest article on his website. And it's called, "Will the Fed Crash Global Financial Markets for Their Great Reset?" So this article in particular is following up on a series that I did a 2-episode series I did a few months ago on Michael Hudson. So one of them, I reviewed an article, Michael Hudson's, that came out right at the beginning of the pandemic and lockdowns in March 2020. That kind of gives over the theme, the economic context within which this global health situation is playing out in, that there's a clear link between what's happening in the global financial system and in the global economic system concerning this great reset and what we're seeing in the world of health, and what we can put together now, having explored in depth the methodological issues that underlie the diagnosis of the health situation as being one that is due to an actual virus epidemic rather than some other cause that's being blamed on a virus. If there isn't actually a virus, which I 100% believe that there's not actually a virus, then that means the tests and the hysteria and the new variants and all that stuff are things that can be engineered to move the sort of large pieces around the chessboard as needed, as this larger shift in that's it's being called the Great Reset, but this larger sort of restructuring of global civilization takes place. So you can leverage all the misinformation in the global health space and use this whole situation as a sort of cover and a mechanism by which you can have these greater economic and political changes act out. So that's sort of some of the background context. So let's go look into a little bit on this. So actually, let me recap real quick a couple points from that Michael Hudson article, just so we were on the same page. Hudson wrote that, this is in March 2020. He wrote that even before the COVID-19 crisis, financial markets were in an inherently unstable condition. Years of quantitative easing had loaded so much money into stock and bond prices that stock prices and the earning multiples and bond prices derived from them were far too high by any normal and reasonable historical standards. And then he writes that the Fed's quantitative easing policy since 2008, which is basically a nonstop bailout policy, plus large companies using their earnings for stock buybacks, meaning companies aren't reinvesting their earnings in their sort of long-term future, but it's an extremely short-term mindset, which is they're using almost as a coordinated strategy. The executive management teams of these large companies are using their assets to do stock buybacks and that way elevate the price. And it keeps that central group of who are getting the stocks, the central executive management groups, it keeps them paid because it keeps their stocks high. And then when they sell their own stocks, which are inflated, their companies will buy, as a policy, will buy it and keep the price up. This coordinated policy of quantitative easing and stock buybacks has driven the price of financial assets into a realm of unreality. And this is over a period of over a decade. So it's the stock market and the financial system is one giant bubble, essentially. And then Hudson writes, if there's anything that was going to change in this policy, if either the stock buyback stop or the quantitative easing program stops, then markets that are already teetering on the brink of fragility will certainly collapse. And he writes that any rise of normal interest rates to more normal conditions are bound to crash the artificial values at which financial markets have been priced because of these policies. And then he notes the Fed's policy was to perpetuate the situation for as long as possible by pumping in ever more credit via this quantitative easing. So this whole situation has provided the appearance of stability. And again, I think that this appearance of stability was put in place while the alternative system that we're seeing now, this Great Reset system, has been developed in the background. ultimately the current system has to die because it's so far from being a valid system. It's departed so much from the laws of nature. Essentially, it's like a zombie system that is just teetering. So anyway, the Hudson writes that the only way out of this situation is to have a sort of what he calls a debt jubilee, but essentially a writing off of that whole debt leverage system and replacing it with something else. Now, here we come to F. William Engdahl's new article. So that Michael Hudson article was written in March 2020. So now let's look into December 2021. What are we looking at? So F. William Engdahl here writes that it's looking increasingly likely that the U.S. Federal Reserve and the globalist powers that be will use the dramatic rising of inflation, which is what we're seeing now, this inflation issue, as an excuse to bring down the U.S. financial markets and with it crash the greatest financial bubble in history. And like Michael Hudson, F. William Engdahl points to the cause of this enormous inflation being this sort of like fictitious pumping up of the U.S. economy. He also notes that and this is something that Michael Hudson couldn't have known in March 2020, but the political lockdowns mixed with trillions of dollars in emergency spending, coupled with the continuation of the Federal Reserve's near zero interest rate policy and their kind of quantitative easing program of asset purchases, all going towards the effort of basically keeping this bubble inflated a little bit longer. All these things have set the stage for an imminent market collapse. That's what F. William Engdahl's writing. And so he says that the stage is set for the central banks to bring down the debt bloated system and prepare their great reset of the world financial system. So the Great Reset, I haven't done too many episodes on this, but I did focus it as a whole documentary series around it called Mr. Global. If you go to my website, alexsakin.com, you can find links to that series along with the two sibling series I put together. One's called The Deep State, which I plan on posting soon on the podcast, the audio version of that. And then, so that's on one end, and on the other end is the Secret Space Program docuseries. So I have those three: Mr. Global, Deep State, and Secret Space Program. And my feeling is that this so-called Deep State concept, which is really what we're looking at as being the organizer of this, it's sort of this national security umbrella that covers almost all aspects of society. But the social engineers, that group is actually not one homogenous thing, but there's like a shadow side, there's like a polarity, there's a shadow side, and then there's the I think the more, I don't want to call it noble side, but I do think that there is an aspect that is not this sort of like sinister cabal that we're basically tracking with the situation that we're seeing in the world today. This is basically how I feel it works, is that the aspect of the deep state that is acting on the world has this sort of like fascist kind of tendency, this totalitarian type of mindset. There's a very cynical view of human life. This is a group that is obsessed with the idea of genetic determinism, which itself is an aspect of scientific materialism. So we have this one aspect of the deep state that is obsessed with this aspect of scientific materialism. So that's really the group that I'm covering in the Deep State documentary and the Mr. Global documentary series. But I think the polarity of that is the Secret Space Program aspect, which I think is hidden within the Deep State. So it's almost like the sort of like really antisocial, highly destructive group that's associated with the oligarchical interests of the early 1900s and their legacy that continues, basically stretches from the Rockefellers to the Gates Foundation, that whole group is this sort of outer coating of this sort of caste that exists, this area of social activity, and the sort of core of that's hidden uh, behind all this activity on the surface is this basically what I call the secret space program aspect, which is definitively not grounded in the ideology of scientific materialism, but is instead sort of rediscovering and researching alchemy and the basically the physics of metaphysics, of how to engineer technologies and engineer things, factoring in a completely almost the opposite worldview of the sort of Rockefeller and Gates types. So we have so for me that explains. So basically, I think we've had a revelation in the past few years of both of these aspects of the deep state. Because on one hand, you see sort of a revelation of this coordinated sort of cabal of interests they seem to be, organizing what's happening in the world, the sort of Great Reset group and the various aspects of the deep state behind that. But then you also have this UFO mystery. And for me, the revelation of this UFO mystery within national security, within the sort of military, points to a hidden aspect that is different from this one, because the ideology, the sort of technology tree would develop for this inner group that's researching metaphysics is completely different than that which is espoused from the sort of Great Reset group, which is definitely, their worldview is definitely grounded in this sort of like spiritual atheism and scientific materialism. So my feeling is that at some point in this whole process, we're going to see some sort of resolution to this issue, because we haven't really heard anything from the secret space program group other than the acknowledgement that there are, super classified military projects to research UFOs. That UFOs have been known for decades and have been dealt with and researched. Okay, but we never ever hear about what the effects of that are, or what the worldview is of people who do that kind of research. So these things seem completely separate right now, and I'm just saying that I feel like the deep state group has this polarity to it. But right now, those who are tracking the sort of like agenda behind world events are only focusing on the Great Reset group. And so it's unknown, but I feel like at some point the influence of this other group will come out. But I don't know what that's going to look like. But my feeling is at the core of the secret space program research, at the core of that, the center of that that's where the sacred knowledge is held, and has always been held within this caste structure by the priesthood, the sacerdotal groups. And my feeling is that at the core of the research projects into metaphysics and into UFO technologies, that within that group is the mysteries, the sort of modern version of the mysteries. So that's my feeling. So basically I'm looking at the caste system as having three rungs to it, just like a very simple model. You have the exoteric on one side, you have the esoteric on another side. So exoteric is like the common population and what we believe. The esoteric is the sacred knowledge, which is at the heart of the whole of society. It's sort of in the archetype of human civilization. There's always this sacerdotal group that carries and maintains the sacred knowledge, which is knowledge of metaphysics and spirit. And then in between those two, you have this vast realm with lots of different actors. And the lower rungs of it are the state, like the governing aspect, that interfaces directly with the people. So like government and finance and all those people are the outer aspect. And then it kind of moves gradually in towards the deep state, and then seeks into this whatever bureaucracy is doing the secret space program. So that is the basic situation. So returning to F. William Ingdahl's article now, he's saying that the stage is set for central banks to bring down the debt bloated system and prepare their great reset of the world financial system. Now, one thing that is very clear is that the central banks of the world right now have been working on a digital currency, central bank digital currency, and seems to be at the heart of what they're going to replace the debt bloated system with, a digital system. And there's a number of different features of a digital system that you can do. Like you can do like a social credit score integration, or you can do all kinds of stuff with a digital financial system. So we're looking at like a totally different model of a totally different link of governance and finance. And in a lot of ways, I think you see the democratic processes that have been slowly eroded in societies all over the world, sort of Western developed countries. There's a gradual eroding of rights and liberties. It seems part of this transition to a new model of governance that's moving beyond a sort of like side-by-side link between the normal functions of the state and the existence of the financial system as a sort of autonomous structure. Like the financial system, the organization of a central bank system means that it's autonomous from the state. So these two exist side by side, where the sort of trend is the state becomes smaller and smaller in terms of their ability to be a check and balance on the financial system. So I think what we're going to see with the central bank digital currency thing is that the financial group becomes very dominant in their ability to participate and direct the governance of society. So let's go back to the article. He says context for what's happening in the world right now is key. And he says, first of all, the decision to crash the financial system is being prepared amid the global pandemic measures, number one, which have devastated the world economy. And I mean, this is very clearly true that there's some disaster capitalism going on. I mean, it's explicitly mentioned in the Great Reset material where they're saying that we cannot waste this crisis, that everything's being shut down, the world economy is being destroyed, so we need to use this as a chance to rebuild and reinvent, to build back better, so to speak. So that's number one, the crash of the global economy because of the pandemic. And again, remember that this is a lot easier to do in a coordinated way if you understand that all the information about the spread of the virus and the death numbers and all the hysteria and everything on the news and stuff like that, it can be very easily controlled and coordinated and sort of organized into these strategic operations because of the fact that of how the PCR tests work, how the death numbers are calculated, the fact that you have quote unquote surging hospital numbers all the time. For 2 years, every time I look at the New York Times, it says surging something or other. The hospital numbers surging. People are going crazy. It's just nonstop fear porn. Well, that's a way to social engineer things in a certain direction. And you can do that because there's not actually any legitimate scientific foundation to these programs. So no one can actually double check your science because the science from the foundation is made up because it's all based on this virus construct, which has never been isolated or shown to be the cause of disease. And that whole argument was what I was putting out in the last few videos, which I've done on virus isolation, the topic of virus isolation. So anyway, he also notes that the context besides the pandemic situation is that the NATO powers led by the Biden administration are tipping the world into a potential world war, meaning that there's been just a lot of talk about Russia and China, essentially. Now, my problem with this is that it's looking at things on the nation state level, while clearly there are linking mechanisms within each of those nation states that are coordinating powers. And for me, the great example of this is with China, because the development of China did not just happen with them independently developing, independent of the United States national policy. The whole globalization initiative and and the closing of the sort of manufacturing base of the U.S. and the exporting it to sort of third world countries, so to speak. That whole thing was I mean, you can look at the Trilateral Commission and just the basic strategy that they were pursuing. You know, that was intended to develop China. So, and if you look at the balance of trade dynamics between the U.S. and China, I mean, everybody focuses on those debt numbers, but the whole reason those debt numbers exist is because of the balance of payments between the two. Is that China making cheap goods and sending them here, and us sending them our dollars, is is that dynamic was set up so that China could follow a certain pattern of development, internal development, and that whole program could not have happened without coordination and support from the U.S. to make it happen. So to gut the middle class of the U.S. and at the same time set up this balance of payments situation with China. So this idea that, you know, we're at war with China, we're at war with Russia, that's looking at things purely on the level of the nation state and the fact that we have a military that's different than their military, than Russia's military, and that we're all beefing with each other. But clearly there is another level of power which is transnational or international, and that level of power will be connected between those nation states. So I'm just saying, my point is that the conflicts between these different nations is only true on one level of the military. Each of those, I think, has a military industrial complex and sort of an inner aspect to its military, just like we do, and that those inner aspects, to me, they seem to be like they would be coordinated. And I think that would be more and more and more true as we go into the deeper black projects of these various countries. Because the whole point of keeping this the sort of secret space program research into ether and into basically alchemy is that it's too dangerous to have this type of knowledge be openly available until you can get the world to a situation where it's all linked together and you can ensure security. Then you can have this technology brought out. And this whole thing that I'm saying here, this whole narrative is just basically retelling an archetype, but because the alchemical knowledge and knowledge of metaphysics and how to manipulate the ether has always been esoteric knowledge. It's always been kept sacred in a way. And, you know, this is actually part of the reason I did that Atlantis zine, because the whole point of the fall of Atlantis was that the priesthood had begun misusing that knowledge, that knowledge of metaphysics, in order to change the manifested world. And the way that they were doing it was not in following the divine plan of creation, but it was following their sort of agenda, the agenda of the priesthood, which had become separated from the divine plan. So, you know, that's one of the reasons I published that zine first, was to basically set out that archetype of the misuse of knowledge, because it becomes surprisingly relevant to today, this Atlantis story, because I think what we're seeing with all of this stuff that we're talking about is a recapitulation of that old Atlantean archetype of misused knowledge and the different castes that were involved and all this stuff, and the sort of fall having directly to do with this misuse of the metaphysical world. So the last point he says in terms of the context of what's happening is this looming collapse of the dollar system is also coming as there's a sort of talk of shifting into this new green paradigm, this new Great Reset paradigm. But part of that, and sort of anticipating moving in that direction, is that we have things set up to make things especially vulnerable at this current moment, which has to do with basically a crisis in energy, and that the energy prices have gone super high, and there seems to be underproduction, sort of a coordinated underproduction of energy going on in terms of the traditional sources of like natural gas and coal and things like that have been sort of suppressed, or the programs have been lowered with this anticipation that we're moving to a Green New Deal. But we haven't done that yet, so we have a lowering of the old industries. At the same time, these other factors are going on, and that's just one more systemic fragility that's existing within our system. So we have to keep all these in mind, that this sort of like systemic fragility is being put strategically into place in all these different sectors. So almost like a controlled demolition can take place. Like a severe crisis happens, it hits all these places sort of as intended, and then the remedy will come and address all these different crises at once. So like classic disaster capitalism kind of design. The key thing is this: the state with this financial collapse is the state of the U.S. stock market. And like Michael Hudson was saying, the fact that it's been blown up into this realm that's completely fictitious, and it's based on this sort of bailout policy and debt leverage sort of policy. And so William Engdahl here writes that since the global financial crisis of 2008, the Federal Reserve and other major central banks have pursued unprecedented zero interest rates and quantitative easing purchases of bonds to bail out the major financial institutions. And he writes that the record rises in the stock market that we see are not proof of a booming economy, as the newspapers and Biden and such will tell you, but rather they're rising because of this zero interest rate policy with the bailouts combination. And he also notes that companies are borrowing at low rates not to expand their equipment and infrastructure so much as to buy back their own stocks, and again, keeping the market inflated. The predictable result has been an artificial inflation of what's now the greatest speculative bubble in history, overtaking even the 07-08 period. He notes that in 08, just after the Lehman crisis, U.S. stocks were listed at a total of $13 trillion in capitalization, but today it's over $50 trillion. And this stock capitalization, which exists, remember, with all these complex debt instruments, kind of ballooning it up and keeping the whole thing tied together, but it's like a house of cards situation. He notes that this speculative bubble is more than double total U.S. GDP. And he notes that there's nearly $1 trillion in margin debt. So that has to do with these debt instruments that are continuously rolled over. And this margin debt is really where you could see the contagion set in, the financial contagion set in, because all it takes is for this thing for a break to happen in the rollover of that debt, and then you have the systemic collapse spread from there. He says he expects the tipping point to be in early 2022 as the Fed announces or maybe pursues what they've been hinting at that they're going to pursue, which is this taper, in which they taper off their old policies of doing these bailouts to the financial industry. So as soon as it cuts these bailouts, then or raises the interest rate, then money is going to flow from the stock market to these government securities, and that's going to trigger the debt collapse of the stock market. And so he notes we're looking at this, the Fed's taper, we're looking at a double whammy. It's reduced the monthly buying of bonds, which is this sort of like QE situation, and at the same time raise key interest rates. He says this is huge, and blood will flow from Wall Street beginning 2022 if the Fed actually does follow through with this policy. He notes that already starting in November, the Fed began reducing the amount that it's of bonds that it's buying. So if we factor in all these different elements, the stock market and the different contextual factors with the pandemic and the energy crunch and all of that, then raising rates at this juncture will bring down the fragile U.S. and global financial system, paving the way for a crisis where citizens might beg for emergency relief in the form of digital money and a great reset. So again, that right there is the sort of hypothesis of how this whole situation could be a agenda of the sort of deep state in terms of social engineering the world into a new paradigm. And what I'm curious to see how the two aspects of the deep state interface with each other as this transition happens. How does the scientific materialism aspect of this, the genetic determinism sort of philosophy of the sort of like Gates ideology, how does that interface with the secret space program, sort of esoteric research that's like super off the books projects world of the deep state? Because for me, that's the real power center, because that's where the real technology is being developed. And that's where it seems like the highest level of scientific knowledge would be developed. So, like the highest knowledge scientific knowledge, I'm sure interfaces with understanding the patterns of the human mind, because that's what you inevitably get into when you start to research metaphysics. And then from that, how do you engineer human activity at large levels? I feel like that knowledge would be much more advanced in the secret space program group than it would be in this other group, in the sort of like Rockefeller Gates group. So I'm wondering how the chemistry of those two poles will interact as this period of change takes place. Will we see this UFO thing become this trump card where we have the revelation of this sort of like global research initiative that's completely off the books and very secret, like everything that we discussed in that secret space program documentary? If that whole situation will come out and that'll be the new sort of governing regime, and you'll see a sort of sacrifice of this whole Great Reset group, which is this based around this ideology of materialism. If we have, so is this shift that we're going to see, this Great Reset shift, is it actually going to be much more of a Great Reset than people even expect? So it's not just a Great Reset in the way that you see Davos talk about it. Becomes this more profound Great Reset where all of a sudden a paradigm ends. Because the Great Reset we see right now is not really talking about a total worldview paradigm. It's more like a governance paradigm and a way of organizing humanity. That paradigm is ending. But what we could see at this deep state group with the secret space program group come in, if that actually becomes externalized, or if that becomes revealed to be a real existing thing, then we could see the end of a whole paradigm of scientific materialism end. And so the acknowledgement that there is a world of metaphysics. And when you open that, then the basic philosophy of alchemy comes out, then astrology starts coming into play, and then you can have basically people realize that we live in a spiritual universe that is organized according to the classic principles of spirit, soul, body, and that the soul level is this metaphysical entity. And so this could lead to a sort of like a religious transformation of mankind, which has been long heralded. And Manly Hall's talked a lot about that, the need for a world religion to come with a world science and a world government. And so, maybe this Great Reset is a larger paradigm shift. I can't say, but it looks like the sort of status quo of where we've been for the past 2 years since this onset of this epidemic, where it's just nonstop domination by this one polarity of the deep state, that maybe this financial crash, which seems to have always been behind this whole thing, this longer term transition in the global finance and economics and politics, that all of this that whole system will play out in a way that's that the group that it seems is engineering the whole thing, that even they haven't expected. So anyway, it's kind of rambling thoughts on this one, but it's a great article by F. William Engdahl. I'll post a link in the description. Check it out. Thanks for tuning in. I will be back with more content soon. Thank you.